When three men bury a wooden box deep in the forest under the cover of night, they think their darkest secrets are hidden forever. What they don't realize is that someone is watching. Driven by curiosity and dread, a young man unearths the box, only to be shocked by what he discovers inside. What follows is a gripping story of survival, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe that one act of courage can change everything, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Blake's footsteps echoed faintly along the empty road, the gravel crunching beneath his worn boots. It was late, and the familiar chill of night crept into his bones, but the silence soothed him. After a grueling shift at the factory, 12 hours of sweat, dust, and machines, he welcomed the quiet. He adjusted his bag over his shoulder and cut through the back roads like he always did. The shortcut saved him 20 minutes, a precious slice of time when his body screamed for rest. The faint glow of the moon barely lit the narrow path, but Blake knew the way by heart. The turn past the oak tree, the uneven patch of dirt, just before the clearing. Tonight, though, something felt off. The low hum of an engine broke the stillness, snapping Blake out of his daze. He paused, ears straining. Up ahead, faint beams of headlights sliced through the trees. Someone was out here. Blake ducked instinctively, slipping off the path and into the underbrush. The last thing he wanted was trouble. Too many stories of people like him ending up on the wrong side of it. From his hidden spot, he could see the faint outline of a van, its doors ajar, idling on the edge of a clearing. Voices, rough, hurried, and low. Blake squinted through the branches. The moon hung high enough to throw long, sharp shadows across the clearing. Two figures were bent over a hole in the ground, dirt flying as they dug with frantic urgency. Another man stood nearby, pacing, his silhouette sharp in the glow of the headlights. "Keep moving!" one of the diggers barked, his voice carrying just enough for Blake to hear. Blake's pulse quickened. He crouched lower, his breath shallow. The men were working fast, too fast for anything good. "What are they burying?" he whispered to himself, his voice lost in the night air. The men grunted with effort, the shovels biting into the earth with quick, sharp thuds. Finally, they stopped. The pacing man gave a clipped order Blake couldn't make out, and the other two heaved something heavy, a large wooden box, into the hole. The thud of impact sent a shiver through Blake. Blake couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away. What was in that box? Why did they need to bury it so fast and so deep? The men covered the box with dirt, their movements mechanical and brutal, as if they wanted the earth to forget it had ever been disturbed. One of them cursed under his breath, slamming the shovel into the mound of soil as the others looked on. "Hurry up!" the pacing man snapped, his voice edged with anger. "We need to go!" Blake pressed a hand to his chest to steady his breathing as the men gathered their tools, shoving them into the van. The headlights swept across the clearing as the vehicle turned, the engine revving before it disappeared down the trail. The night fell silent again, but Blake felt anything but calm. His heart hammered in his chest, and sweat beaded on his brow despite the cold. The clearing sat still now, the only sign of disturbance a fresh mound of dirt where the box had been buried. He knew he should leave it alone. This wasn't his business. Getting involved in something like this was dangerous, but his feet refused to move, his curiosity rooting him in place. "What did they bury?" he whispered again, this time like a question he couldn't ignore. Slowly, carefully, Blake stepped out from the brush. The clearing felt larger now, like it was watching him, daring him to move forward. He approached the disturbed patch of earth, his hands trembling as he dropped to his knees. "This is stupid, Blake," he muttered, but his hands were already working, clawing at the loose dirt. The soil was soft, easy to move, and he worked fast despite his exhaustion. His arms ached, but something pushed him to keep going. Minutes passed. He hit wood, the box. Blake's breathing turned ragged as he wiped the dirt away from its surface. It was large and roughly built, the wood scratched and splintered. There were no markings, nothing to tell him what it was for, only its grim, unnatural presence. Hands shaking, Blake searched for a way to open it. A loose edge caught his attention. He hooked his fingers beneath it and heaved. The lid resisted at first, groaning against his effort. Before it finally snapped open, Blake fell back as the lid crashed to the side, his breath freezing in his chest. Inside the box lay a young woman, unconscious, bound at the wrists and ankles. Her skin was pale, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "Oh my God," Blake breathed. He scrambled forward, his heart racing. She wasn't moving. For a terrifying moment, Blake thought he was too late. But then her chest rose, faint and shallow. She was alive. "Hey," Blake said, his voice hoarse. "Hey, can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Blake glanced around, panic clawing at him. The men could come back. He had no idea who she was, but leaving her here wasn't an option. "Come on, Blake," he muttered, trying to steady himself. Think. He quickly untied the ropes, cutting into her wrists and ankles, grimacing at the deep marks they left behind. She was light, lighter than he expected, but his arms still strained as he lifted her out of the box. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing barely audible. Blake glanced back at the clearing one last time, the shadows swallowing the box and the disturbed earth. Whatever this was, it was far from over. "Hold on," he murmured to the woman, shifting her weight as he stumbled toward the trail. His apartment wasn't far, just a 10-minute walk, but it felt like miles with the weight of this night pressing on him. Every sound made him jump, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. He kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting the headlights to return, the men to drag him down and finish what they'd started. Finally, Blake reached the edge of town, his tiny apartment building looming like a beacon. He pushed through the front door, his arms aching as he carried the woman inside. Gently, he laid her on the old couch, her face pale against the worn fabric. "What did I just get myself into?" he whispered, staring at the unconscious woman. Outside, the night stretched on, silent and watchful. Blake crouched beside the couch, his hands hovering nervously, as he stared at the woman he'd just carried in. She lay still, her pale skin stark against the worn brown fabric, her chest barely rising and falling. The rope burns around her wrists and ankles looked angry and raw, and a faint bruise bloomed on her temple. "Who would do such a thing to a harmless woman?" he whispered, his voice tight. He reached for a clean rag and a small basin of lukewarm water from the kitchen. Kneeling back beside her, Blake carefully wiped the dirt and sweat from her face, wincing at how fragile she seemed under the layer of grime. "You're lucky I found you," he muttered to himself. He worked gently, dabbing at the cuts on her wrists, washing away the dried blood, all the while stealing glances at her face, hoping for some sign she was waking. Each shallow breath of hers gave him a glimmer of hope. "Who are you?" he murmured, though he didn't expect an answer. His small, threadbare apartment felt stifling. The single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling cast sharp shadows on the peeling walls. He glanced at the front door, locked, and then out the window. The street was quiet, but unease gnawed at him. The men who buried her might still be looking for her and for him. He sat back on his heels, his fingers trembling. "Think, Blake. Think," he muttered. Hospitals were out of the question. A young man showing up at midnight with a bound and bruised woman? They'd take one look at him and call the cops. "I need you to wake up," Blake whispered. "Please." Do you think Blake did the right thing by digging up the box and taking Camille home instead of calling the authorities? Could his decision put them both in even greater danger? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're eager to see how this story unfolds, don't forget to like this video and keep watching to find out. Hours passed, and exhaustion tugged at Blake's eyelids. He sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the television, the volume low. The woman hadn't stirred, though her breathing had steadied. Outside, the city was sleeping. The TV flickered as the news anchor's monotone voice drifted into the room. Ongoing investigation into the suspicious death of businessman Daniel Harlow, who was found murdered earlier this week. Blake's head snapped up, his attention riveted. The screen showed a photo of a sharp-looking man in a suit, his expression frozen in a confident smile. The anchor's words barely registered in Blake's ears. Murdered. Something prickled at the back of his mind. a dark connection that wouldn't quite form. The report cut to a new segment. In other news, authorities continue to search for Camille Hayes, the 25-year-old daughter of prominent businessman William Hayes. Ms. Hayes was last seen leaving a gala 3 nights ago, and her family is offering a substantial reward for any information leading to her return. A photograph flashed on the screen. Her photograph. Blake's blood ran cold. "That's you," he whispered, turning to look at the woman still unconscious on his couch. Her face on the screen, framed in bright blonde hair and a dazzling smile, was now smudged with dirt and bruises. Blake's mind raced. Camille Hayes. He'd heard the name before. Her father's company owned half the businesses in town. Wealthy, powerful, and missing. His hands gripped the armrest as panic rose in his chest. "This is bad," he murmured, running a hand down his face. "This is real bad." What if they thought he had something to do with it? He could already picture the headlines. "Factory worker kidnaps heiress." He needed answers, but right now, he just needed her to wake up. The room was silent except for the low hum of the TV. Blake sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, trying to figure out what to do next. A soft sound, a sharp intake of breath, snapped him back to attention. He looked up. The woman was moving. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. She blinked rapidly, confusion flickering across her face. Her breaths turned shallow and quick. Hey, it's okay," Blake said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. She flinched at the sound of his voice, scrambling weakly against the couch cushions. Her arms trembled, too weak to push herself up, but panic was written all over her face. "Where?" Her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Blake said, keeping his voice soft. I found you. In a box. You were..." He hesitated, not sure how much to say. "You were hurt, but you're safe now. I brought you here." "Who are you?" she choked out, eyes darting wildly around the room. "Blake," he said quickly. "My name's Blake. Look, I don't want to hurt you, I swear." Her gaze locked onto him, her chest rising and falling unevenly as tears welled in her eyes. "The box," she whispered, her voice breaking. Blake's heart sank. "Yeah," he said gently. I dug you out. I saw the men burying you, and I couldn't just..." Her hands flew to her face, covering her mouth as sobs escaped her. "I was in the dark," she gasped between breaths. "I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe." Blake's chest tightened. He crouched a few feet away, giving her space but trying to ground her. "You're out now," he said softly. "Whoever did that to you, they're gone. You're okay." Camille dropped her hands, her red-rimmed eyes locking onto Blake's. She started, her voice shaking. "They were going to kill me." Blake didn't know what to say to that. He wanted to comfort her. But what could he say? He couldn't deny it. Not after what he'd seen. Camille's gaze darted to the door, then back to Blake. "Why am I here? Why didn't you take me to a hospital?" Blake hesitated. "I wanted to," he said honestly. "But you're all over the news, and the way you looked, I didn't know how it would look. I was scared they'd blame me." Camille's breathing slowed, and something in her expression softened as she stared at him. She saw it then, the worry in his eyes, the exhaustion on his face. He wasn't lying. "Thank you," she whispered. Blake looked up, startled. "For what?" "For not leaving me there." For a moment they sat in silence. The weight of what had happened hung in the air, unspoken but felt by both of them. Finally, Blake stood rubbing his hands together nervously. "You should rest," he said quietly. "You've been through a lot." Camille sank back into the couch, staring at the ceiling as tears slid down her cheeks. Blake turned off the TV and sat back on his bed, his mind still racing. Whoever had buried her wasn't going to let her escape that easily. He could feel it in his bones. The morning light crept weakly through the blinds, bathing the room in muted grays. Blake sat on the edge of his chair, his knee bouncing as he watched Camille sip water from an old chipped mug. She was pale, her fingers trembling, but her eyes held a clarity he hadn't seen the night before. "How are you feeling?" Blake asked quietly. Camille didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted across the room at the faded wallpaper, the tiny kitchen, and finally at Blake, her expression unreadable. "Alive," she murmured, her voice raw. Blake nodded. "That's something, right?" Camille took another slow sip before setting the mug on the table. "They were going to kill me," she said suddenly, her voice sharper this time. "I remember now." Blake sat straighter. "What do you mean? What happened to you?" Camille's brows furrowed as she stared down at her hands, her fingers twisting together anxiously. "I was at a gala. It was for my father's company. I left early. Too many people. Too much noise." Her eyes narrowed as if focusing on the memory brought it closer. "When I got to my car, I saw them. 2 men. They were waiting for me." Blake's jaw clenched. "They grabbed you." She nodded slowly. "One of them. He put something over my mouth. I tried to fight, but everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in some kind of basement. I could hear them talking, arguing." "Arguing about what?" Camille's face tensed. "I don't know exactly, but I heard one of them say it was her fault. That I saw too much." Blake's throat went dry. "Saw what?" She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. "A murder." Blake stared at her, stunned into silence. The air between them thickened with the weight of her words. "A murder?" he repeated slowly, as if saying it out loud might make it less real. Camille nodded, gripping her knees like they were her lifeline. "It's coming back in pieces," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't know where I was, some office or warehouse, but I saw them kill him. I saw a man on the floor, blood everywhere. There was shouting, and then they saw me." Blake dragged a hand over his face, his mind spinning. "You said you were at your dad's gala, so who—" Camille swallowed hard, her gaze far away, as the pieces clicked into place. "Daniel Harlow," she said quietly. Blake froze. "Wait, Harlow? The businessman? The one they said was murdered?" She nodded again, and Blake shot to his feet, pacing the small room. "I saw it on the news," he muttered. "They found him 2 days ago. The cops were calling it suspicious, but they didn't say anything about witnesses." "Because they didn't think there were any," Camille whispered. Blake stopped and turned to face her, his expression grave. "You saw it happen. That's why they took you, that's why—" He trailed off, unwilling to say the rest. "They buried me," Camille finished for him, her voice trembling. The words hung in the air like poison. Blake sat down heavily, his hands clasped between his knees as he tried to process what she was telling him. He'd thought finding her in that box was the worst part. But this was bigger than anything he'd imagined. "You remember any of their faces?" he asked, trying to stay focused. "No," Camille said with frustration. "It was dark, and everything happened so fast." "But I heard a name." Blake's eyes snapped to hers. "What name?" "Marcus." The name landed like a stone in Blake's chest. "Marcus," he repeated quietly, his mind churning. "That mean anything to you?" Camille's lips pressed into a thin line. "It could," she admitted reluctantly. "My stepbrother's name is Marcus, but no." She shook her head as if trying to dispel the thought. "It couldn't be him." Blake raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Camille's hesitation told him everything. "I don't know," she said finally. No. Marcus and I don't get along, but I can't see him doing something like this." Blake exhaled slowly. "Well, someone named Marcus was involved, and if you're right, they buried you to keep you quiet." Camille shivered, pulling her knees to her chest. "And now you're involved too," she whispered. The words hit Blake harder than he expected. He sat back in his chair, the reality of his situation sinking in. She was right. Whoever these men were, they wouldn't just stop looking for her, and now they'd be looking for him too. "Maybe you should have left me there," Camille said suddenly, her voice bitter. Blake snapped his head up. "Don't say that. You don't know what you're dealing with," she shot back, her eyes flaring with fear and anger. "These people are dangerous. You should have walked away." Blake leaned forward, his voice steady. I couldn't walk away. I saw what they did to you. You think I could just let you die out there?" Camille looked away, her expression softening. Silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Blake stood shoving his hands into his pockets and pacing the room again. "You think it's your stepbrother?" he asked after a moment. Camille hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know. Marcus is complicated. My father remarried when I was little, and Marcus always resented me. But murder?" She scoffed weakly. "I can't wrap my head around that." Blake turned to her, his gaze steady. "Whoever it is, they're not going to stop looking for you, or for me." Camille hugged herself tighter, her expression conflicted. "I didn't ask you to save me. And I didn't do it for a thank you," Blake said firmly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. But we can't sit here and wait for them to come back." Camille's eyes met his, wary but searching. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to figure this out," Blake replied. "We need a plan. You can't go home, and I'm not about to let those men find you again." Camille studied him, a flicker of trust breaking through the fear. "Why are you helping me?" Blake hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because no one else did," he said quietly. "And you didn't deserve this." For the first time since she woke up, Camille's expression softened into something that looked like gratitude. She nodded faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay?" Blake exhaled, relief washing through him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The morning sun filtered weakly through the window blinds as Blake pulled back the curtain, his fingers curling around the edge of the fabric, his gut twisted. Across the street, parked under the shade of a dying oak, sat an unfamiliar black sedan with tinted windows. He narrowed his eyes. "That's the third time this morning," he muttered under his breath. Camille, perched nervously at the small kitchen table, looked up from the bowl of cereal Blake had hastily prepared for her. "What?" Blake turned toward her, forcing his expression into something calmer than he felt. "Nothing. Stay here, all right? I'll be back." She frowned, hugging her knees to her chest as he slipped on his jacket. "Where are you going?" "Just to take a look," Blake replied, his voice low and reassuring. Camille's eyes darted to the window. "You think it's them, don't you?" Blake hesitated, then nodded once. "I don't know who else it could be. They know you're alive." Camille's face paled as her gaze dropped to the table. Blake turned and left the apartment, carefully shutting the door behind him. Outside, the early morning air was crisp, though Blake felt none of it. His focus was razor-sharp as he walked toward the street, pretending to check his phone. He could feel their eyes on him from the car, like heat boring into his back. The engine suddenly revved. The sedan jerked forward and pulled away, its tires skidding slightly against the asphalt. Blake stood frozen, his heart hammering, as the car disappeared around the corner. He spun on his heel and hurried back upstairs, his thoughts racing. When he opened the door, Camille was waiting. "What happened?" "They're watching us," Blake said grimly, shrugging off his jacket. "I don't know what they're planning, but they know you're here. You stay away from the window, all right?" Camille swallowed hard and nodded. "What are we going to do?" "Figure something out," Blake replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But for now, we don't leave this apartment." The hours passed like molasses, slow and heavy. The two of them sat in Blake's cramped living room, Camille on the couch, knees drawn up, and Blake on the floor with his back against the wall. The silence had stretched too long, growing heavier with each passing minute. Finally, Camille broke it. "You live here alone?" Blake glanced up at her. "Yeah, been on my own since I was 17. She stared at him, surprised. 17? "Yeah." Blake's voice was flat, but not unkind. "My parents passed. Car accident." Camille blinked, her expression softening. "I'm sorry." Blake shrugged. "It is what it is. Life doesn't slow down for nobody. You just keep moving." Camille tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "That's awful." "It's just life," Blake said. "I dropped out of school and started working. Factories, repairs, whatever I could find." Camille bit her lip. I've never worked a day in my life." Blake's brow furrowed as he looked at her. "Must be nice." She shook her head. "It's not what you think. My father's company has been my entire life. He worked so much I barely knew him. My stepbrother Marcus," she hesitated, trailing off. "I was alone in a house that didn't feel like mine." Blake's gaze softened. "All that money, and you still felt alone?" Camille nodded faintly. "You can have everything and still have nothing." The two sat in silence again, but this time it felt different, less cold, more understanding. Finally, Blake sighed. "Well, you aren't alone now. We're going to figure this out." Camille glanced at him and managed a small, fragile smile. "I believe you." That night, Blake lay awake on the thin mattress of his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. He could hear Camille shifting restlessly on the couch in the next room. Sleep wasn't coming for either of them. Then a noise. Blake froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The creak of floorboards outside the apartment door. He shot upright, his heart pounding as adrenaline flooded his veins. In an instant, he was on his feet, moving silently across the floor toward the living room. Camille sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" she whispered. "Quiet." Blake grabbed a rusty wrench from the kitchen drawer and motioned for her to stay low. A shadow shifted outside the window. The doorknob jiggled. Then came a sharp knock. Once, twice. "Blake," a gruff voice called, muffled through the door. "Open up." Blake's grip tightened on the wrench. "Who's there?" There was no answer. Instead, the door shuddered violently as someone kicked it. Camille flinched, pressing herself back against the couch as Blake moved closer to the entrance. "Get away from the door," Blake yelled, his voice ringing through the apartment. Another kick. The wood groaned under the pressure, and Blake knew it wouldn't hold. His eyes darted to Camille. "The fire escape," he hissed. "Go now." "What about you?" Camille whispered frantically. "Go." She scrambled toward the window as Blake braced himself. The door splintered open, and two men rushed in, their faces obscured by hoods. Blake swung the wrench hard, catching the first man in the ribs. The man stumbled back with a grunt. The second lunged at Blake, tackling him to the ground. Blake's head slammed against the floor, sending sparks across his vision. But he fought back, landing a hard punch to the man's face. "Camille!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "Run!" Camille was already halfway down the fire escape, her breath ragged as she descended the creaking ladder. Behind her, the apartment rattled with sounds of struggle, grunts, crashes, and the dull thud of fists connecting. Moments later, Blake staggered through the window, blood smeared across his cheek. "Let's go!" They hit the alley running. The streetlights buzzed overhead as they sprinted through the dark, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. Blake grabbed Camille's arm, pulling her along as headlights flared behind them. "They're still following!" Camille cried, glancing back. Blake's pulse thundered in his ears. "We gotta lose them!" They darted around a corner and down a narrow alley, shadows swallowing them whole. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, the sounds of the car faded into the distance. "We can't stay here," Blake said between breaths. Camille nodded, clutching her sides. "Where do we go?" Blake looked at her, determination etched into his bruised face. "The city. We'll figure it out from there." Together they hurried down the sidewalk, their steps fast but quiet. The bus station was small and nearly empty, the ticket clerk half asleep behind the glass window. Blake fished a few crumpled bills from his pocket, enough for 2 one-way tickets to the city. The bus rumbled softly beneath them as it pulled out of the station, its headlights slicing through the darkened streets. Blake leaned his head back against the seat, the vibrations of the engine a faint comfort after everything that had happened. Camille sat next to him, silent, her hands tightly gripping the strap of her jacket. She stared out the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. After a long moment, she turned to Blake. "Do you think we lost them?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of all her fears. Blake exhaled slowly, glancing around the nearly empty bus. A few passengers sat scattered throughout, heads down, lost in their own worlds. Outside, The dark city blurred past them. "Yeah," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We're good. They don't know where we're going." Unbeknownst to them, the black sedan lurked just a few streets away, its occupants watching and waiting. The motel room was dim and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew. Blake sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes scanning the parking lot through a slit in the curtains. Camille was curled in the corner of the room, knees pulled tight to her chest, exhaustion weighing her down. "This place is a dump," she muttered quietly, her voice thin. "It's the kind of dump where no one asks questions," Blake replied, lowering the curtain. "We just need a few hours. Once it's light, we move again." Camille sighed, rubbing her temples. "How much longer can we run?" Blake didn't answer, though her words hung heavy in the room. The faint rumble of an engine outside snapped his attention back to the window. He moved closer, heart racing as a black SUV crept into the lot, its headlights dimmed. "Camille," he said quietly, "get up." "What?" "Get up, now." Camille saw the look in his eyes and scrambled to her feet. Blake grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the back door, whispering, "Stay behind me and don't make a sound." A loud bang echoed through the room as the front door splintered, kicked in with brutal force. Camille gasped, stumbling, as Blake shoved her forward. Two men burst into the room, their heavy boots pounding against the wooden floor. "Go!" Blake shouted, pushing Camille toward the alley door. He turned back to block the men, grabbing a rusted chair and swinging it into the first intruder. The man staggered, cursing loudly, but the second one tackled Blake, slamming him into the wall. Blake's head snapped back, stars flashing in his vision as fists rained down on him. "Run, Camille!" he managed to choke out, his voice ragged. Camille hesitated for a split second, terror etched into her face, before bolting through the back exit. Blake fought to break free, landing a desperate punch to his attacker's ribs. He scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth, but it was too late. Through the doorway, he saw Camille being dragged toward the SUV. One man threw her into the back seat, slamming the door shut as the tires screeched against the pavement. "No!" Blake stumbled forward, but the other man tackled him again, pinning him to the ground. Blake's fists flailed weakly, his strength fading fast. The sound of the SUV speeding off roared in his ears as darkness threatened to pull him under. Finally, the man released him, muttering something Blake couldn't hear, and fled toward the parking lot. Blake lay on the ground, his body battered and shaking, his breathing ragged. He forced himself to sit up, wiping blood from his mouth as he struggled to his feet. Camille was gone. The city was a blur of lights and shadows as Blake stumbled down an alley, clutching his side. His jacket was torn, his face bloodied, but his steps didn't falter. He didn't know how long he walked, or how many blocks passed beneath his boots before he found himself outside an old brick building. He banged on the metal door, his knuckles leaving smudges of blood. "Eric!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Eric, open up!" After a moment, locks clicked, and the door creaked open to reveal a tall, wiry man with grease-stained hands and weary eyes. Eric took one look at Blake and swore under his breath. "Blake!" Eric grabbed his arm, pulling him inside. "Man, what the hell happened to you?" "Help me!" Blake panted, collapsing onto a tattered couch. "They took her. They took Camille." Eric crouched beside him, looking him over. "Who's Camille? And what did you get yourself into this time?" "I'll explain later," Blake groaned, wincing as Eric pressed a damp rag to his split lip. "I need your help. I saw the SUV they used. I remember part of the license plate." Eric frowned, but his curiosity overpowered his skepticism. "Plate number?" Blake nodded, his vision still swimming. "It started with L5P black SUV. They're taking her somewhere. I need to find her, Eric." Eric stood muttering a curse as he grabbed his laptop from the cluttered kitchen table. "You're lucky I still know how to do this," he said, typing quickly. "These bastards sound serious. If I find out you're dragging me into something illegal—" "I'm not," Blake said firmly. "It's not like that. She's in danger. They buried her alive, Eric." Eric froze, his fingers hovering over the keys. He turned to look at Blake, his face a mix of disbelief and concern. "What did you just say?" "You heard me," Blake replied, his voice cold. "They buried her alive. I pulled her out. They're coming after us because she saw something she wasn't supposed to." Eric stared at him for a long moment, then swore again, and turned back to the screen. "All right. Partial plate number L5P black SUV. Give me a second." The room fell silent except for the rapid click of keys. Blake pressed the rag to his lip again, his mind racing. He couldn't stop seeing Camille's face, terrified as they dragged her away. Finally, Eric let out a low whistle. "Got something. There's a match. An SUV registered to a shell company. Last tracker pinged it on the outskirts of town." Blake sat up, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs. "Where?" "A warehouse," Eric said, turning the screen toward him. A small red dot marked the location on the map. "Looks like they're keeping her there." Blake's jaw tightened. "Then that's where I'm going." Eric snorted. "You can barely stand, man. What are you going to do? Walk in there and ask politely for them to let her go?" "I'll figure it out," Blake said, struggling to his feet. "I'm not leaving her." Eric sighed, rubbing his face. "You're out of your mind." He grabbed his car keys and tossed them at Blake. "Fine. I'm coming with you. You'll just get yourself killed otherwise." Blake caught the key's gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, man." "Don't thank me yet," Eric grumbled. "We're probably both going to die." Eric's beat-up sedan rattled as it sped down the dark back roads. Blake stared at the GPS on Eric's phone, the small red dot growing closer. His fists clenched in his lap. "You sure this is the place?" Eric asked, eyes fixed on the road. "It has to be," Blake muttered. "We don't have time to second-guess." Eric glanced sideways at him. "You're a stubborn fool, you know that?" "Yeah," Blake said, his voice grim. "But what do I have to lose?" The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. Eric slowed the car, pulling off the road and killing the engine. They sat in silence, staring at the building, as faint lights flickered from within. "Game plan?" Eric asked. Blake's gaze was hard, his voice low. "Get Camille, get out." Eric shook his head with a humorless chuckle. "Simple. I like it." Together they stepped out of the car and into the shadows, the faint hum of machinery drifting toward them. Blake tightened his grip on the crowbar Eric had handed him, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I'm coming, Camille," he whispered. The hunt wasn't over yet. The first thing Camille registered was the cold. It seeped into her skin, biting and merciless, as her eyelids fluttered open, her head throbbed, her mouth dry. When her vision sharpened, she realized where she was, tied to a rickety wooden chair in the middle of a dimly lit warehouse. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like they might burn out at any moment. Her wrists burned from the rough rope digging into her skin. She tugged at her bindings instinctively, panic rising in her chest. "Don't bother," came a cold, familiar voice. Camille froze. From the shadows, Marcus emerged, hands tucked casually into the pockets of his tailored coat. His face was expressionless, but his eyes were sharp and cold, as if he took no pleasure in this, only duty. "You're awake," he said, stopping a few feet in front of her. "That's a shame." "Marcus!" Camille's voice cracked, disbelief and terror twisting together. You did this?" Camille choked on her words. "Marcus, how could you—" Marcus tilted his head slightly, a faint sneer playing on his lips. "What did you think would happen, Camille? That you could waltz into the wrong place, see something you weren't supposed to see, and walk away unscathed?" Camille's breathing quickened. "I don't understand." Marcus stopped pacing, his face hardening. "Do you know what Harlow found out? He uncovered, let's call them my side businesses. But Harlow was too nosy. He threatened to go to the police." Camille's chest heaved. "You killed him." "Yes," Marcus admitted without hesitation. "And you saw it. So you had to go too." Camille's stomach twisted, her mind reeling as Marcus's words began to sharpen into something darker. "You think this is about you stumbling onto some insignificant crime?" Marcus laughed bitterly. It's bigger than that. You've always been in my way. You, with your fake smiles and your father's approval." Camille blinked back tears, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" "Because you leave me no choice," Marcus cut in coldly, straightening as he paced slowly around her. "You always have, Camille, ever since the day my father brought you and your mother into our house." She stared at him, horrified. "I'm your family, Marcus." "Family?" Marcus hissed, his voice sharp. "You're not my family. You're an outsider, a leech. Your mother stole my father's attention, and then you did the same." "That's not true." "It doesn't matter anymore," Marcus snapped, cutting her off. "With you gone, I'll have everything. Everything. You're the last obstacle between me and what I deserve." Camille's heart raced as tears streaked down her face. "You won't get away with this," Marcus smirked, his calm demeanor returning. "I already have." He stepped closer, looming over her. "The men here, they'll finish the job this time, and when they do, no one will know what happened to poor little Camille Hayes." Her stomach dropped as Marcus turned and strode toward the warehouse doors. He paused at the threshold, glancing back one last time. "Goodbye, Camille." The doors slammed shut, leaving her in silence. Camille sat frozen, her mind racing. She yanked at the ropes again, her wrists raw and bleeding. But they wouldn't budge. She could hear footsteps, Marcus's men no doubt, ready to do exactly what he promised. "Please, God," she thought desperately, tears blurring her vision. "Not like this." A sudden clatter from the far end of the warehouse jolted her out of her thoughts. The footsteps paused, a voice grumbling. What was that? The men moved toward the noise, their footsteps fading into the shadows. Camille's heart hammered in her chest. Was someone here? Then she saw him. From the corner of her eye, Blake emerged from the dark, moving quickly but quietly toward her. Dirt streaked his clothes. A faint cut ran across his forehead, but his eyes burned with determination. "Blake," Camille whispered, her voice cracking. "Shh," he murmured, crouching beside her. He pulled a knife from his pocket and began sawing through the ropes. "We gotta move fast. Can you walk?" "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "How did you—" "Later," Blake muttered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Let's get you out of here." The last rope fell and Camille staggered to her feet, her legs weak. Blake grabbed her arm to steady her. "Come on." They moved toward the back exit, sticking to the shadows. Camille's pulse roared in her ears as they slipped between metal crates and stacks of pallets. But just as they neared the door, a voice shouted behind them, "Hey, stop!" The warehouse exploded with noise, shouts, pounding footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Run!" Blake barked, pushing Camille toward the exit. One of the men lunged out of the darkness, grabbing Camille's arm. She screamed, kicking wildly, as Blake swung a crowbar he'd grabbed from the floor. It connected with a sickening crack, and the man crumpled to the ground. "Keep moving!" Blake shouted, dragging Camille through the door and into the cold night air. The warehouse yard stretched before them, an open space littered with rusted equipment and broken concrete. Headlights flared in the distance. "That's Eric!" Blake yelled, pointing to a beat-up car barreling toward them. Behind them, the warehouse doors slammed open. Marcus's men poured out, shouting and firing blindly into the night. Blake ducked, pulling Camille with him as they sprinted for the car. Bullets ricocheted off metal pipes, sparks flying in the dark. The car screeched to a halt just as they reached it. Eric threw open the passenger door. "Get in!" Blake shoved Camille inside before diving into the back seat. "Go! Go! Go!" Eric floored the gas pedal, tires squealing as the car lurched forward. One of the men fired again, the bullet shattering the back window in an explosion of glass. Camille screamed, ducking, as Eric swerved onto the main road. "Are they following us?" Eric shouted, his voice frantic. Blake twisted in his seat, blood streaking his face as he peered through the shattered window. "No, I think we lost him. Just keep driving." Camille sat curled in the front seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, tears streaming down her face. Blake reached forward, his voice softer now. "Hey, you're safe. You hear me? You're safe." Camille turned to him, her face pale but resolute. "Not until Marcus pays for this." Blake nodded grimly, slumping back into the seat as the city lights blurred outside the window. "He will," he muttered. "I promise you that." The car sped into the night, leaving the warehouse and the danger for now, far behind. The low hum of Eric's desktop computer filled the cluttered apartment as Camille sat stiffly in front of the webcam, her hands trembling in her lap. Blake stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her carefully. "You sure about this?" Eric asked, typing commands into the keyboard. "Once this goes out, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure," Camille said, her voice steady, despite the fear in her eyes. "It's time everyone knows what Marcus did." Eric leaned back, studying her. "All right then. You're live in 3, 2. He pointed at the camera. Camille took a shaky breath and looked directly into the lens, her face pale but resolute. "My name is Camille Hayes," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "4 nights ago, I was kidnapped and buried alive. I'm lucky to be alive to tell this story." Blake shifted slightly, his jaw tight as he listened. Camille continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "The man who did this is Marcus Hayes, my stepbrother. He orchestrated the murder of businessman Daniel Harlow and tried to kill me because I saw it happen. He buried me to silence me, and when I survived, he hunted me like an animal." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "But I won't stay silent. Not anymore." Eric glanced at Blake, who gave a slight nod of approval. The screen behind Camille displayed pictures of Marcus and Daniel Harlow, alongside details of their connection. Eric had worked through the night, piecing together enough information to make the story undeniable. "I'm asking for help," Camille finished. "If you know anything about Marcus Hayes or his associates, go to the police. This man is dangerous, and he needs to be stopped." The screen went dark as Eric cut the feed. The room was silent, except for Camille's ragged breathing. Blake stepped forward, his voice soft. "You did good." Camille exhaled shakily and nodded. "Let's hope it's enough." The sun was barely rising when the first wave of notifications hit Eric's computer. His phone buzzed nonstop, lighting up the dark room with alerts. Camille sat beside Blake on the couch, clutching a steaming mug of coffee, her face drawn with exhaustion. "It's everywhere," Eric muttered, eyes glued to the screen. "The video's already gone viral." Blake leaned over his shoulder, watching news anchors dissect the story on live broadcasts. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen in bold red letters. "Heiress Camille Hayes resurfaces. Claims stepbrother, responsible for kidnapping and murder." Reporters speculated wildly as photos of Marcus filled the screen alongside Camille's recorded plea. Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags calling for justice, users condemning Marcus, and demands for his arrest flooded every platform. Camille set her mug down with a soft clink. "Do you think he's seen it yet?" Eric smirked, tapping a few keys. "Oh, he's seen it. If he hasn't, his guys sure have. Marcus can't hide from this now." Blake ran a hand over his face. "Good, let him sweat." Eric turned toward them, his expression suddenly serious. "You know this makes us targets too, right? He's going to be desperate now." Camille nodded, her gaze steely. "Let him come. He doesn't scare me anymore." Blake looked at her with quiet respect. She was different now. Shaken, yes, but no longer afraid. By afternoon, the police had gotten involved. After the video went viral, Camille's family lawyer contacted the authorities, and a plan began to take shape. Sitting in a small, sparsely furnished room at the precinct, Camille, Blake, and Eric listened as the lead detective laid out the strategy. "We'll need Marcus to believe the meeting is real," the detective explained. "The idea is to bait him with something he can't resist, a chance to silence Camille and tie up loose ends, but he'll be cautious." Eric, leaning back in his chair, crossed his arms. "So let me be the greedy guy who sells her out. I'm believable, right?" Camille shot him a sharp look. "You're volunteering to hand me over?" Eric smirked. "Only pretend to. I'll make it look like I caught you and want a payday. Guys like Marcus, they think everyone's got a price." The detective nodded. "It's a solid angle. Marcus won't trust Camille to show up willingly, but he might buy it if someone else delivers her. We'll wire you with audio and stay out of sight until we have him." Blake turned to Eric, his expression serious. You sure about this? They'll believe you're on their side? Eric shrugged. I know how to play scum when I need to. Fine, Camille said, her voice steady despite her unease. But I'm not letting you do this alone. I'm going. The detective hesitated. It's risky. If Marcus suspects anything, I'm the bait, Camille said firmly. He needs to see me. Blake clenched his fists, reluctant but understanding. We'll keep you safe. That evening, Eric sat slouched at the kitchen table in his apartment, burner phone in hand. Camille and Blake stood nearby, watching anxiously. Time to sell it, Eric muttered, dialing the number Marcus's men had used before. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. What do you want? Listen, Eric said, letting an edge of impatience creep into his voice. I've got something I think you're looking for. The girl, Camille. A pause. Who are you? A guy who found her, Eric replied smoothly. Don't worry how. What matters is, I've got her, and I know who she is. Word is, Marcus pays big to clean up his messes. There was silence, then a sharp, Where is she? Eric smirked, glancing at Camille and Blake. Relax. She's fine, but I'm not handing her over for free. 10 grand cash. I'll deliver her. Midnight. The old shipping yard off Route 9. You think you can play us? The man growled. No, Eric said, his voice calm and cocky. I think you've got a problem, and I've got the solution. You want her or not? The man hesitated, then relented. Fine. Marcus will meet you there. Come alone. If you're lying... I'm not, Eric cut him off. You'll see. The call ended with a sharp click. Eric tossed the phone onto the table, a satisfied grin on his face. They bought it. Blake exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. It's on now. Camille wrapped her arms around herself, her expression a mix of determination and fear. This has to work. Eric nodded, grabbing his keys. Don't worry, it's showtime. The old shipping yard off Route 9 was a graveyard of rusted containers and crumbling machinery. Under the pale glow of the moon, the air hung heavy and still, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of metal swaying in the wind. Blake crouched behind a stack of crates with Camille and Eric, his fists tightened around a crowbar, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Camille, clad in an old hoodie and jeans, stayed low, her face tense with fear and resolve. Showtime, Eric whispered, motioning toward the far entrance. From the shadows emerged Marcus. He strode forward confidently, flanked by 3 men in dark suits. His posture was casual, almost smug, his expensive coat flaring slightly in the cold breeze. The moonlight carved sharp angles into his face, but his eyes, cold and predatory, gave him away. You really pulled her out of the dirt, Marcus said, his voice echoing as he approached the meeting spot. I've got to admit I'm impressed. I didn't expect anyone to be so resourceful. Eric stepped forward, feigning indifference as he shrugged. Like I said, 10 grand, and she's yours. He nodded toward the shadows where Camille was supposed to be hidden. Now, where's my money? Marcus raised an eyebrow, a cruel smirk tugging at his lips. Do you really think I'm going to hand over cash for something that should have been dealt with days ago? Eric tensed. A deal's a deal. Marcus lifted a hand lazily, signaling to his men, Kill him. Bring me the girl. Before they could draw their weapons, the air split with shouting, Freeze! Police! Drop your weapons! Floodlights blazed to life, turning the shipping yard into a blinding panorama of chaos. Red and blue lights flashed as officers swarmed from every direction, their guns drawn and voices commanding. Marcus's smug confidence shattered in an instant. He spun on his heel, panic flickering across his face as his men scattered like rats, only to be tackled and cuffed. The police worked quickly, overwhelming the scene in a matter of seconds. Get your hands off me, Marcus roared, his face twisting as 2 officers grabbed his arms, forcing him to his knees. Do you know who I am? Camille stepped out of the shadows, her expression unflinching as she approached him. Marcus froze when he saw her, his face pale, despite the flashing lights. You tried to bury me, Camille said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, but you failed. Marcus sneered, though his eyes betrayed his fear. "This isn't over." "Oh, it is," Camille replied coldly. "You're done." The officers dragged Marcus to his feet, reading him his rights as he was shoved into a waiting squad car. Blake, standing nearby, let out a long breath. "It's over," he said quietly. Camille nodded, a hint of relief breaking through her steely expression. "Yeah," she whispered. "It's over." The Hayes estate was sprawling, its towering gates illuminated in the golden glow of the afternoon sun. Blake parked Eric's beat-up car near the edge of the driveway, staring at the grandeur before him. "This is her house?" Eric muttered, craning his neck. "Man, I should have charged a finder's fee." Blake shot him a look. "Not the time, Eric." Camille stood by the car, clutching her hands together nervously. "I haven't seen my father in days. He probably thinks I'm dead." Blake gave her an encouraging nod. "He'll be glad to see you." Camille took a shaky breath and walked toward the grand entrance. Blake followed a few steps behind, his presence steady but quiet. The front doors opened, and Camille's father, William Hayes, appeared. His face was pale, as if he'd aged years in the days since she'd disappeared. When his eyes landed on Camille, his expression crumpled. "Camille!" His voice cracked, disbelief and hope warring in his tone. "Dad?" Camille whispered. In an instant, William closed the distance between them, wrapping Camille in a crushing hug. I thought I lost you," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "They told me you were gone." Camille clung to him, her own tears finally breaking free. "I'm here, Dad. I'm here." William pulled back, cupping her face as if to convince himself she was real. "How is this possible? The police couldn't find you. Then I saw the video on the news. Why did Marcus do this?" "He killed Daniel Harlow, and he tried to kill me," Camille said firmly. William staggered slightly, as if the weight of the revelation might crush him. "My own son." He covered his face, his shoulders shaking. "How did I not see it?" Camille placed a hand on his arm. "It's over now, Dad." After a long moment, William straightened and looked past Camille to where Blake stood awkwardly near the car. "Who is this?" Camille turned and gestured for Blake to step forward. "This is Blake," she said, her voice soft with gratitude. "He saved me. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." William approached Blake, extending his hand. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Blake shook his hand firmly. "You don't need to, sir." William frowned, studying Blake's torn clothes and tired face. "You risked your life for her. I owe you everything." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Camille found Blake sitting quietly on the back patio, staring at the sprawling gardens. "My father wants to repay you," Camille said as she approached. Blake shook his head, a faint smile on his face. "I don't want his money." Camille sat beside him. "It's not about the money. He wants to help you." Blake looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't need anything, Camille. I'm just glad you're safe." Camille's eyes softened. "You've spent your whole life helping others, Blake. When was the last time someone helped you?" He looked away, silent. Camille reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope. "My father wants to pay for your education," she said gently. "Full tuition. Anywhere you want to go." Blake's eyes widened as he looked at her. "What? You told me you had dreams, Blake." "To get a college degree," Camille said. "Now's your chance." Blake stared at the envelope, his throat tight. For years, dreams had seemed like a luxury he couldn't afford. But now... "Take it," Camille urged. "For once, let someone give back to you." After a long pause, Blake nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Camille smiled softly. "You earned it." Blake looked out over the gardens, the weight on his shoulders finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, a future that once seemed out of reach felt closer than ever. The courtroom buzzed with tense murmurs as spectators filled the benches. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting sharp angles across the oak walls. At the front of the room, Marcus Hayes sat stiffly at the defendant's table, clad in a dark suit that did little to mask his weariness. His face, once smug and untouchable, now looked drawn, his eyes darting nervously toward the jury. Camille sat beside her father in the front row, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Blake sat further back, watching quietly, his jaw set. "All rise," the bailiff announced. As the judge entered, the trial had stretched for days, the evidence building a damning case against Marcus. Witnesses, paper trails, and forensic evidence had painted a grim picture of greed and violence. Camille's video had been the spark that ignited it all. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, rose and delivered her closing statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Marcus Hayes believed he was above the law," she began, her voice strong and unwavering. "He orchestrated the cold-blooded murder of Daniel Harlow when his criminal dealings were threatened with exposure. He abducted his own stepsister, Camille Hayes, buried her alive, and left her to die simply because she was a witness to his crimes." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Camille's steady gaze. "This case is not about family feuds or misunderstandings. This is about greed, violence, and a complete disregard for human life. Marcus Hayes thought he could silence Camille forever, but he failed. She survived, and today the truth is here for all of us to see." The prosecutor turned to the jury, her voice resolute. "Do not let Marcus Hayes escape justice. The evidence is undeniable. Hold him accountable for his actions." She returned to her seat, and the courtroom fell silent as Marcus's defense attorney stood, attempting a weak rebuttal. But the weight of the evidence left his words hollow, his arguments frail. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the room fell into an anxious hush. Camille gripped her father's hand as the foreman stood unfolding the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant Marcus Hayes guilty on all counts: murder, kidnapping, and attempted murder." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marcus's shoulders slumped, his face crumbling as the judge announced his sentence: life imprisonment without parole. Camille let out a slow breath, tears welling in her eyes. William Hayes placed a hand on her shoulders, his own expression heavy with grief and relief. Marcus was led away in cuffs, his eyes briefly locking with Camille's. There was no hatred left in his gaze, only the hollow realization of defeat. As they left the courtroom, Camille turned to Blake, her voice soft. "It's over." Blake nodded, a small, proud smile on his face. "Yeah, it is." The door closed behind them. The echoes of justice served lingering in the quiet air. The late afternoon sun filtered through the wide windows of the bustling college library. Blake sat at a desk near the back, surrounded by a stack of textbooks and loose papers covered in his tidy handwriting. His brow furrowed as he scribbled notes into a notebook, pausing every now and then to glance at the outline of his upcoming essay. "Mr. Taylor?" Blake looked up startled. A professor stood by his desk, smiling kindly, as she handed back a graded paper. "Excellent work, Blake. Keep this up, and I'll see you on the dean's list." Blake offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, ma'am." The professor moved on, leaving Blake to stare at the crisp A scrawl in red ink across the top of his paper. A quiet pride swelled in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He leaned back in his chair, glancing out the window where students laughed and chatted across the green campus lawn. It felt surreal sometimes, this life he now had. A clean slate, a future worth building. Blake still remembered the day Camille's father had handed him a check that covered tuition and living expenses. He'd been hesitant at first, unsure if he deserved it. But Camille had looked him square in the eye and said, "You earned this, Blake. You saved my life. Now build yours." And after countless applications, here he was. Gathering his books, Blake shoved them into his bag and slung it over his shoulder. As he walked through the campus toward the exit, he allowed himself a small smile. This wasn't just a college, it was a chance to turn his dreams into reality. The park stretched out like a painted canvas, the sun sinking low on the horizon. Streaks of orange, pink, and lavender lit up the sky as the air turned cool and still. Blake sat on an old wooden bench, elbows resting on his knees as he watched the colors deepen. A soft rustling of footsteps made him glance up, and there she was, Camille, her face radiant in the golden glow of dusk. "Hey," she said softly, sitting beside him. "Sorry I'm late." Blake smiled faintly. "You're right on time." For a moment they sat in companionable silence, watching the sky change. Birds flitted overhead, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. "I heard you aced your first term," Camille said, nudging him playfully with her shoulder. Blake chuckled, ducking his head. "You heard right. I'm doing my best not to let everyone down." Camille turned to face him, her expression gentle. "You're not letting anyone down, Blake. You never have." He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment the weight of their shared journey hung between them. "It still feels unreal sometimes," he admitted. "Like any minute, it could all disappear." Camille smiled softly. "It won't. You've earned every bit of this." She paused, her voice quieter. "You didn't just save my life, Blake. You gave me hope again. I'd been surrounded by people my whole life, but I never felt like I had anyone I could trust. You changed that." Blake hesitated, then met her eyes, his voice soft. "You saved me too, Camille. I didn't think about the future much before all this. After my mom and dad died, I lost hope. You gave me something to believe in." The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving behind the faintest traces of gold on the edges of the darkening sky. Camille smiled, her face illuminated by the first scattered stars. "Looks like we saved each other," she whispered, and for the first time in their lives, the future felt bright. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like and subscribe for more.